If you're an experienced Universal Analytics user, and you've gotten into GA4, you're probably wondering where some things have gone and notice that some things work differently. So we're going to talk about those differences. I'm going to explain concepts in GA4 in the context of what you're familiar with in Universal Analytics. I'm going to go through page views, goals, events, e-commerce tracking, do sessions work differently, applying segments, audiences, and finally talk a bit about engagement tracking, which is something where GA4 has really introduced some metrics and capabilities that far exceed engagement tracking in Universal Analytics. So let's have a look. I'm in the 2 October's my organization's GA4 account. And to look at page views, we're going to go to reports, and then engagement, pages and screens. So I wanted to include this because I've heard some people talk about how page views mean something different in GA4, and it doesn't really. Page views have become views, and part of the reason for that is Google wanted to make GA4 kind of neutral about, are you interacting with a mobile app versus a website? So a view could be a screen view or a page view, but the way the metric is counted is pretty much the same. In the case of Universal Analytics, page views, you had actually a page view tag. In the case of GA4, page views are one of several automatically collected events that you get when you install the GA4 configuration tag. What's happened to goals? So Universal Analytics, we had these goal slots and we could create goal 1, goal 2, goal 3, up to goal 20. We could give them names. And they existed as sort of each goal was a metric. In the case of GA4, you'll notice over here I have conversions. So goals, for all intents and purposes, goals have become conversions. They do behave a little bit differently. So in many reports, we have this conversions column. And if we want to see a specific goal, we can just hit this drop down. So if I wanted to just report on contact us submissions, I can see that there. We'll pop over into admin, go to events, and this is really actually a really nice feature, I think, of GA4. Whereas in Universal Analytics, you had this process for setting up goals. In the case of GA4, any event can be a conversion. So I can flag it as a conversion, and there is a conversions metric that I can report on that sums total conversions. And then in the reports that have that conversions column, I can see the specific event conversions from there. So works a little bit differently, a little bit more flexible, but a downside is that I don't have specific columns, which would matter, for example, if in a report I want to create a column for contact us submissions and career submissions, and I want to have those two columns as metrics in a custom report, for example. I can't actually do that in GA4. I would have to actually make my own custom metrics from each of these conversion types. Events is a pretty complicated topic in GA4. I've recorded a whole video that kind of goes into depth in events, but since we're here, so all the data that gets collected in GA4 comes in as events. And really, I guess the short version of this is that events in Universal Analytics don't have a direct translation in GA4. You could say they're replaced by events, but not really, because events in GA4, they are how data gets collected in GA4. So they underlie everything. So a page view is an event, an e-commerce transaction is an event, whereas in Universal Analytics, a page view was a page view and a transaction was a transaction. So in GA4, everything is an event. I never liked how events worked in Universal Analytics. Really, if you wanted to report on them, they existed in a separate report. The process of collecting the category action label, I think, was kind of hinky. Events in GA4, you add parameters. Parameters have specific names. So the name is meaningful rather than just having this sort of free-for-all of like if you've worked with GA much, you've encountered like one person decides that they're going to say that the category is form submit, and another person's going to say the action is form submit. And, it's just honestly, it's just pandemonium. Whereas in GA4, we give meaningful names to parameters. Then we can take those parameters and translate them into custom metrics or dimensions. So I'll pop up a link here as well so you can watch the video that goes into events in more detail. E-commerce tracking also hasn't really changed that much. If you're familiar with enhanced e-commerce tracking in Universal Analytics, the e-commerce tracking in GA4 is fairly similar. I'm going to go and pull up, because on my website, I don't have e-commerce tracking because we don't do e-commerce, but everybody can get access to Google's demo account. And so I'm going to come here and I'll show you what e-commerce tracking looks like. I'm in the GA4 Google Merchandise Store account. This is something that Google makes available. Just search GA4 demo account and the first link you get in Google will be a page where you can get access to this. So we'll go to reports and then monetization. And then we can come in here and we can see some e-commerce details. So we've got item views, added to cart, items purchased, the value. We have some overview metrics. So all the data is collected comparable to what you got in Universal Analytics. But whereas Universal Analytics had that funnel checkout view and had built-in reports to see really all the different values that you're collecting, that is not so true here. So if I hit the drop down in this view, I can look at item category, item brand. To me, this is a little bit more clunky, but overall the data that's being collected is the same. And you can build your own custom explorations if you go to explore to look at different dimensions that you're collecting. So for example, if you wanted to report on I don't know, the percentage of orders that you're paying tax on for something like that. That is data that you can get, but you're going to have to build your own custom exploration to get data like that. I've also heard people talk about how the concept of sessions has gone away, and that isn't really true. If you look at the data that gets collected in GA4, there is a session identifier. I mean, basically sessions still very much exist. I think the underlying data model sessions are treated a little bit differently, but similar to Universal Analytics, we can go and if we go to, data streams, and right now I'm in the GA4 demo account, bigger tag settings. And if I go to show all, so adjust session timeout. So here we've got this 30-minute timeout. I can't adjust it because I'm in the Google Analytics demo account. This is not an account I have write permissions in. In any case, you see it's 30 minutes. I could change it. Maybe where people sometimes get confused is in GA4. I'm going to pop back to October's account. If I go to acquisition, you'll see these user acquisition and traffic acquisition. So traffic acquisition is reporting on sessions, and it's showing me, for example, the channel group by for a given session. So organic search drove this number of sessions. Then this is another big leap forward with GA4 compared to Universal Analytics. I also have these user reports. What first user means is how a user first got to the website. So in this case, I've got organic search drove this number of users. It actually defaults to new users. Not quite sure why. On one they show users, the other they show new users. So we've got the number of users. These are just two different ways of looking at data. One is how users first came to the website, and another is like a session-focused view, which is more analogous to Universal Analytics. So if you wanted to look at a report that compares to the acquisition, all traffic, default channel grouping, you want to look at this traffic acquisition and use this dimension here. If you wanted to look at the equivalent source medium report, you can come up here and you can say session source medium, and that'll be equivalent to the acquisition, all traffic source medium report in Universal Analytics. Segments is a little bit weird. So from here, I can't actually apply segments in standard reporting in GA4, at least not yet. What I can do is I can apply comparisons, which are basically like segments light. So from here, if I wanted to look at like device category, and I just want to look at mobile traffic, for example, then I can apply that. And so you can look at overall versus mobile. I could get rid of just overall if I wanted to do that and just look at mobile traffic. So that if you've used segments in Universal Analytics, that does replace some use cases. But in Universal Analytics, you have the ability to define segments using multiple conditions. You could use regular expressions. You could do a lot of complicated stuff that you can't do here. I'll pop up a link to a video I recorded where you can actually apply audiences as comparisons. So you can look at just an audience and get back almost the functionality that you have with Universal Analytics. But the other curious thing I'll show you is if we go to explorations. So explorations are sort of like custom reporting, except for that the reports are different, like the capabilities are fundamentally different than what exists in the reporting menu. So from here, I do actually have the ability to create segments very much like what I could do in Universal Analytics. So if you really rely on segments in Universal Analytics, then I recommend going in and getting the hang of explorations where you can create segments to your heart's content. And we cross our fingers and hope that Google adds segments to standard reports. Almost last. Let's have a look at audiences. I mentioned, and I'll show you what I was describing. And again, I've got a whole video that goes into this. So if I look here, I've got audience name. So I can apply audiences. I can actually filter on audiences, or I can do comparisons between audiences. If we go and look at audiences in GA4, I can import audiences into Google Ads the way I could with Universal Analytics. And when I create audiences, on the whole, anything I could do in Universal Analytics, I can do here plus some. So I can create audiences. I guess what I like about the way audiences work in GA4 is because events are so flexible, and it's a simpler model than Universal Analytics where you had these different hit types. You had page views and transactions and page timing and yada yada. In GA4, everything is an event, and then I can create conditionals with event names, event parameters. I can say when this value matches this or contains that. I can do sequence logic. So I can say if a person does this and then does something else, I can say whether that's direct or whether it's indirect, meaning if they do this and then the next thing they do is that, then put them in an audience, or if they do it later. And here if this is user-based, I could change that to session-based. A little bit more power and flexibility, but otherwise fairly similar to how audiences work in Universal Analytics. The last thing I want to touch on, and this really doesn't have a comparable feature in Universal Analytics. This is something that is very new and different, and I think one of the best things about GA4 is if we go to any of these reports and we'll look at traffic acquisition, for example. So average engagement time per session. So this engagement metric. So we had bounce rate, we had time on site, we had pages per visit. The thing with Universal Analytics is that Universal Analytics, if you just put the Universal Analytics tracking tag on your website, it just tracked page views and didn't really actually track genuine engagement. So GA4 does something super cool, which is that it actually keeps track of when you have a website in the foreground of your browser. Meaning that, you'll notice in my browser session, I've got 2 Octobers up here. Now, it's been up for a little while because I was poking around on it a little while ago. So if I go back now and I do whatever, so the last time I was here was less than half an hour ago. This is going to count as part of the same session, so it's going to look like a really long session. Whereas GA4 has the ability to keep track of engagement time. So the engagement time would be really short, even though the session duration might be long, because the session duration is really just, I was on the website and I left, and it's still up in my browser, but I came back and I did something else, and that counts as part of the session, whereas I was not engaged that whole time. So way better metrics in terms of understanding how people are engaging with specific pages, with your website as a whole. If we look at this engagement rate metric, this is sort of the inverse of bounce rate. So where bounce rate in Universal Analytics was measured single interaction visits was a bounce, and the percentage of single interaction visits was the bounce rate. The problem with that was that the way Universal Analytics is implemented on most websites, a page view is the main thing that's getting tracked. So somebody could land on a page and spend a while on that page and leave, and that's a single interaction, so that would actually count as a bounce. Whereas GA4 is actually measuring engagement. Once a person has engaged, I think it's more than 10 seconds, they spend more than 10 seconds and they scroll or they do something else, that even though they're staying on the same page, because GA4 actually collects a number of different types of interactions, that person is going to count as engaged and count towards engagement rate. So think of engagement rate as what you wished that bounce rate was. It's the inverse of that. There you go. Quick tour of some of the features from Universal Analytics and how they translate into GA4. And thank you for watching.